I'm Marianne Nitsch, and I'll be moderating today. And I think that the attendees have been let in, but if I'm not correct, please write something in the chat so we can fix that. So welcome to the Graves, Dougherty, Heron, and Moody virtual women's event, Beyond the Book, Why They Marched. I see a lot of colleagues, clients, and friends in this group of participants, and we're so glad for the opportunity to get together virtually and reflect on the centennial of the 19th Amendment through a discussion of the book, Why They Marched by Susan Ware. We'll have 4 panel members today, and I'll take a moment to introduce each of them. First, we have Mary Keeney. Mary is a shareholder focusing on litigation in courts and before administrative agencies. She is board certified in appellate law. Mary has been recognized in the Best Lawyers in America and Texas Super Lawyers for the last decade and is a dedicated volunteer with Austin Meals on Wheels program. Mary, would you wave so everyone can see you? Yay. Natasha Martin is a shareholder whose practice focuses on administrative and regulatory litigation, with an emphasis in environmental and utility law. She serves on the Executive Committee on Women United, a program of the United Way, and the State Bar's Water Rights Council. Recently, she's also added to her resume, kindergarten Zoom teacher. Natasha, will you give us, thank you. Third, we have Kate Davy. Kate is an associate who focuses on transactional matters relating to commercial and residential real estate and the representation of land and mineral owners in oil and gas transactions. Outside of work, she's active in the Real Estate Council of Austin, the United Way, and the Dell Children's Trust. And she became a new mom in March. And finally, we have Hailey Suggs. Hailey is an associate who joined the firm in 2018 following her graduation from the University of Michigan. Her practice covers a breadth of civil litigation in state and federal courts. She's actively involved in the United Way Emerging Leaders Program in Austin and the Austin Young Lawyers Association. The book we'll be discussing today, Why They Marched, is a book that's organized in 19 chapters on different persons or objects who shaped the path to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. It's not necessarily a feel-good story, and a major component of it intersects with the history of racial discrimination in the United States. Our panelists today will be sharing their thoughts and reactions on the book. Most importantly, the 19th Amendment did not resolve the issue of suffrage for many women of color and immigrant women who continued to battle for voting rights for the decades to come. Just one quick housekeeping item before we go on with the discussion. We're going to hold space for questions and additional audience participation until the end, but feel free to share any reactions or comments in the chat as the discussion goes on in real time. So to start off, the first question, I'm wondering what chapter did all of y'all think was the most impactful? And we'll start with Natasha.
Okay, I'm off mute now. Is that right?
Right, and yes, and you know what? Can we start with Hailey? I misspoke.
Okay, sure.
Well, I guess it's because I had chapter 1, so it makes sense. But I read about Susan B. Anthony and the Rochester 15. So I was already familiar with this story, as many of us are in elementary school and middle school, but I hadn't revisited it in quite some time. So as a bit of background, voting in the 19th century occurred in privately owned structures as opposed to public schools or that sort of thing today, like warehouses and livery stables and saloons, which weren't exactly places where a respectable 19th century woman was found. But on November 5th, 1872, Susan B. Anthony entered one of these polling places and voted a straight Republican ticket. So this all started off with an editorial that appeared in the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle that had urged all registered voters to vote, and it urged all people to register to vote using ungendered language, and Susan B. Anthony took them up on it. So she and her 3 sisters went to the local registration spot, which is a barber shop, and asked to be allowed to register. So she fully expected to be turned down from this, and she was going to use that denial to challenge women's rights to vote in courts. But surprisingly, the inspectors agreed to enter their names on the rolls. And taking advantage of this, Susan got the word out. So all told, Susan and 14 other Rochester women committed the crime of casting a ballot on that November day. So 2 weeks later, a US Marshal served a warrant for her arrest. And in January of 1873, a grand jury indicted her. She was charged with violating the Enforcement Act of 1870, which was a federal law designed to cut down on voter fraud in the post-Civil War South. The next step was a trial in front of her peers, all men, which began in June of 1873 in front of Ward Hunt, who had recently been appointed to the US Supreme Court by President Ulysses S. Grant. After the prosecution and defense presented their cases, Judge Grant turned to the jury and began to read from a prepared statement, prepared long before the trial had begun, and said that perhaps if the 14th Amendment had included the word sex, Susan's 14th Amendment argument would have merit, but it didn't. So her 14th Amendment argument was that the 14th Amendment conferred broad rights of citizenship without reference to gender. So since women were already citizens, and they already had the right to vote because it was a right of citizenship, which couldn't be taken away by the states. But the 14th Amendment, in Judge Hunt's eyes, did not give women the right to vote, and so he said. At her sentencing hearing, Susan asked for the full rigors of the law, of which she received a $100 fine and court costs, which she then said she would never pay, and she never did. And I think her legacy has a lot to do with the power and speaking up, and the power in saying what you believe in and acting on those beliefs without fear of repercussion. But with that, I'll turn it over to chapter 2.
That's my cue. So before jumping into chapter 2, I want to take a minute to introduce our moderator, Marianne. Marianne joined our firm's civil litigation practice in 2017, following a year in big law in clerking for the Honorable Judge Marmolejo of the U.S. Southern District of Texas. I'll note that Marianne makes the best comfort cookies, and she is fur mom to her dachshund Clementine. And chapter 2 was the story and the legacy of Sojourner Truth. And I was moved by her abolitionist story and her suffragist stories. The book also covered how she uniquely positioned herself as a tech pioneer in photography. And so I'll do my best to cover all of that. There's a lot to cover. But as Marianne and Hailey noted, the 19th Amendment was not a success story for Black women. And the vote wasn't one for us when the 19th was ratified, because it did nothing to address state Jim Crow laws blocking immigrants, Native Americans, Black men and women from voting. But women like Truth set the example for civil rights activists and also for the voter suppression fights that we see today. So briefly, by way of background, Truth was born into slavery sometime around, we believe, 1797, and she was born under the name Isabella Baumfree. She was sold 5 times in upstate New York. She had 5 kids. Despite some reports saying she has 13 kids, historians believe it was 5. And in 1826, her slave owner promised to free her before New York emancipated slaves. And not surprisingly, he reneged on that promise. And so Isabella made a plan for escape, and she fled with her youngest daughter, which was a baby girl named Sophia. And also importantly, I think you should know part of the shaping of her activism. Isabella at the time, she sued Dumont for illegally selling her 5-year-old son, Peter, to a slave owner in Alabama after New York had already emancipated slaves. And historians believe that she was the first Black woman to sue a white man in the United States courts and win. So a little bit about her name. So she changed her name to Sojourner Truth in 1843, declaring that God had called her to travel the United States and speak her truth. And the name translates into itinerant preacher. And she did just that for 30 years, speaking on anti-slavery and women's rights. And so I'll cover kind of the speech that everyone, well, many of us might have learned about in school, the Ain't I Woman speech. There's a lot of controversy about this speech, but Truth explored and spoke on the concept of intersectionality as early as the 1850s. And speaking to the Women's Rights Convention in 1851, she used her identity as a former slave and a Black woman to point out the ways in which the country's movements for both of these groups were failing Black women. And this speech is known as Ain't I a Woman? So the first speech that we think about, that was published in 1863. Now that's 12 years after the speech was given. This speech was published by Francis Gage, and it includes a Southern slave speech pattern. And that's part of the reason why it's criticized as not being accurate. The other version, and the one that historians think is the most accurate, was published a month after the speech was given, and it was published in the Anti-Slavery Bugle by Truth's friend, Reverend Robinson. And she traveled and did speeches with Reverend Robinson. And we also think that the Southern speech pattern speech isn't correct because Truth's first language was Dutch, and she lived most of her life in upstate New York. And so it's unlikely that she spoke with that Southern twang. So I'm gonna read a little bit from the Robinson speech, the one that we find to be the most accurate. In her opening, she declared that the sexes are equal. She says, I am woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed, reaped, husked, and chopped and mowed. And can any man do more than that? I have heard much about sexes being equal, and I can carry as much as any man, and I can eat as much too. Later, she continues, and I just love this speech. I won't read it all, but I'll put a link to it in the chat. Later, she continues, if women have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold. She closes like this. Man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. Woman is coming on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard. This type of advocacy for women and anti-slavery by a Black woman before, during, and after the Civil War was very dangerous, but Truth persisted and she kept speaking for many more years. She was a frequent speaker at suffrage events, and something that I learned from this book is that there was an alliance between the abolitionists like Truth and Frederick Douglass and white suffragists during the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. But that alliance broke when suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton started to publicly support literacy tests and property requirements for Black voters. And so Frederick Douglass kind of came around, but Truth really didn't. And her presence at these white suffrage events was really just a reminder of the racism that persisted in the suffrage movement. Quickly, I'll talk about the photographs that I mentioned early on. Truth really propelled herself to celebrity with photography. And the carte de visite was a French method of taking pictures with a small portrait of a person mounted on cardstock. And soldiers carried them of their loved ones, and Truth used this photography to become probably one of the most widely known, recognized African Americans of her time. And in her photos, like this one, she's seated here with her white bonnet and shawl. And that kind of self-representation was copied by many suffragists to come. I mean, we'll see photos of Lucretia Mott and some with Susan B. Anthony and Stanton, kind of with the same self-presentation. Truth really took it kind of a step further. And at the time, photographers held the copyright to these photos. But what Truth did is that she snuck around that ownership, and she put a slogan on the front. I don't know if you can see it, but down at the bottom under her photo, it says, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." And she sold these photos to fund her speaking tours. And shadow was a common term for the technique. So she's really kind of making a play on words here. This photo, we believe, is the first and only copyright of a carte de visite in 1964. And so kind of to close, in 1883, following her death at age 86, Frederick Douglass, another women's rights activist, he offered this about her in a eulogy: distinguished for insight into human nature, remarkable for independence and courageous self-assertion, devoted to the welfare of her race, she has been for the last 40 years an object of admiration to social reformers everywhere. And I think she still is. There's so much about Truth. I've got to move on, but you know, there's hundreds of speeches. She even bared her breasts in a speech when somebody questioned her sex. I mean, she's phenomenal. But that's all the time I have, and I will share a link to Ain't I a Woman in the chat feature.
Thanks so much, Natasha. That was really interesting. I guess some people could say that she was the first kind of an early Instagram celebrity with her cards.
There we go.
Mary, and next I think, Mary, you wanted to share about the impact the story of Ida Wells Barnett had from the book on you.
This was chapter 7 of the book. Ida Wells Barnett was born a slave in Mississippi during the middle of the Civil War. And she was first active in protesting racial discrimination before she became active in the women's suffragist movement. And she was really something of a Rosa Parks of her day. In 1883, she had paid for the full price for a seat on the ladies' car on a train. And when she arrived, they wouldn't let her on because she was Black. So she sued the railroad. She won at one point, but it was ultimately reversed on appeal. She was also an anti-lynching activist and published articles dealing with that subject matter in a newspaper she ran out of the town of Memphis. And that resulted in her offices in Memphis being trashed. After she had basically enough of that harassment in the South, she moved to Chicago and married a lawyer. It was in Chicago that she became active in the women's suffrage movement. She joined the Chicago Political Equality League, what a name, which was an offshoot of the Chicago Women's Club, which was a very elite white women's organization. Wells Barnett was determined to get African-American women involved in supporting women's right to vote. In addition to joining that Equality League, she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in 1913, which was the first African-American suffrage organization. Now, while the overwhelming majority of African-Americans at this time were Republicans, times certainly have changed on that score, Wells Barnett was determined to have the Alpha Suffrage Club be nonpartisan. One of the big events of the day was a march in the spring of 1913 in Washington, D.C. that coincided with Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And the Alpha Suffrage Club was tasked with raising money for that march, but the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association which was to participate in the march, decided they needed to keep their delegation entirely white in order not to upset the Southern women who were also planning to march in the Washington, D.C. March. They did have a separate place for the African-American women toward the back of the march. That sounds somewhat familiar. And Wells Barnett was having none of it. When the all-white Illinois delegation began marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, she calmly walked into the group and joined them next to a female friend who was supportive of her participating in the march. And she marched with them. And fortunately, I guess maybe, the women were polite. Nobody complained and the march proceeded without incident. And that's just a small piece of my story about Ida Wells Barnett, but she was a real fighter in the day, and in a really pretty effective way.
Thanks for sharing that, Mary. That's a great story. She's so admirable. Next, I think Kate will share some about chapter 13, which was about mountaineering for suffrage.
Yes, so I really enjoyed this chapter, and like Marianne said, it's called Mountaineering for Suffrage. So it's exactly what it says. They discussed women climbing mountains while fighting for women's suffrage, and this is specifically in Washington. The NAWSA held its 41st annual convention in July of 1909 at the University of Washington. And the convention also coincided with various other activities that were trying to draw suffragists to Seattle that summer, one of which was the alluring ascent of Mount Rainier. And the ascent was a first for the suffrage movement, but it was also part of a very long and proud tradition of women climbing. And these women climbers were really quite independent characters. They were accustomed to breaking down barriers and not held back by prejudice or custom. And that description really applied to Cora Smith Eaton. She was the first woman licensed to practice medicine in the state of Washington. And in 1907, she became the first woman to climb the almost 8,000-foot east peak of Mount Olympus. And she went on to actually climb all 6 of Washington's major peaks. And so when she climbed Glacier Peak, I thought this was kind of neat. She actually wrote "Votes for Women" after her name in the register on the top, which I thought was pretty neat that she did that. And of course, during the 41st convention of the NAWSA's, along with the Mountaineers Club, that's when she planted the "Votes for Women" flag on top of Mount Rainier. One also thing I found interesting about this chapter was the gear that these women were climbing in. It wasn't, they weren't going and getting, high quality gear. It wasn't available. They were climbing in straw hats, in flannel shirts, probably not adequate footwear, but they were doing this to really to fight for women's suffrage. And I just thought that was really interesting. It didn't matter what they were wearing. They were going to do this and they were going to achieve this. And 2 years actually after Eaton's planted the "Votes for Women" flag on top of Mount Rainier, Annie Peck Smith planted a "Votes for Women" banner on the summit of the second highest mountain in Peru, which is the 21,000 Nevada Corpuna. She was 65 years old then and still going strong. And I just think this chapter was so incredibly inspiring and symbolic of the challenge that they were facing. It really linked women's conquests of mountains with the larger struggle for women's right to vote.
Thanks for sharing that, Kate. You're right. They probably weren't able to go to REI and
exactly
and get Cliff Bars for the journey.
Exactly.
Turning then to the next chapter, I think Mary's going to share a little bit about cartooning in the women's suffrage movement.
Right. This is chapter 16 of the book. It's called Cartooning with a Feminist Twist. And there were a number of women who became accomplished cartoonists in support of the women's suffrage movement. They are not very well known today, and that's because they didn't publish in newspapers or magazines that were of general distribution, but mainly in publications where the readers were already largely supportive of the women's suffrage movement. And the approach that most of them made to cartoons was carefully tailored to make the suffragist movement appear mainstream and supportive of women's traditional roles as wives and mothers instead of a radical political movement, which I think was a strategic move on their part. The one cartoonist I wanted to talk about today was Nina Allender, and she was a leading cartoonist. She provided the illustration for the covers of many issues of the Suffragist, which was a magazine that was around at the time. And let's pull up, can we pull up the first cartoon? There we go. This one, I had to, so we didn't violate copyright laws. I had to pull these from the Library of Congress. Marianne taught me that one. So it doesn't show, but this was actually on the cover of the March 31st, 1917 issue of the Suffragist. What's interesting, it looks like a very traditional picture. This looks like a mother and her child, but in fact, if you look at it, the briefcase or suitcase that the mother has, it says J.R. Montana. That woman is Jeanette Rankin of the state of Montana, and she was the first woman elected to Congress. So there was a little bit of radicalism in there, but it's done in a very subtle, traditional way. And then the little girl is reaching out to her, and she has on her skirt this phrase, Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And then the two nice conservative looking women in the background say, that child needs a woman to look after her. So, you know, that was sort of the approach that a lot of the political cartoonists of the day took. And I guess I got interested in her because she was like Ida Wells Barnett, although to a much lesser degree. She wasn't born a slave, but Allender's participation in the suffrage movement came after she had some hard struggles of her own. She was training to be an art teacher when she met and married an Englishman. And the Englishman proceeded to steal from his employer, and then he skipped town with another woman. So she was a single woman who had to support herself. And she got a job in the US Treasury Department. And apparently federal jobs were the frequent recourse for women who didn't have husbands to support them, although it was probably mainly white women. But while she was working, she became interested in the suffragist movement and began to contribute to political cartoons, mainly to the suffragist. Woodrow Wilson, who was generally regarded as not sufficiently supportive of women's suffrage, and that's one of the things I thought was interesting, is that it looked, to a great extent, this was a republic. I mean, the Democrats were not known for being supportive either of African Americans or of the women's suffrage movement back in those days. Times have changed, but and Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, but he was generally regarded as not sufficiently supportive of women's suffrage, and he was frequently one of Allender's targets. There's a cartoon that's in the book that shows 3 suffragists behind prison bars who were jailed for obstructing traffic while picketing the White House. I can't show you that one because I can't be sure that I'm not violating the copyright laws, but I can show you one that I found at the Library of Congress. And that's, can we put up that second cartoon? Okay. And so there you have your donkey as the Democrat. And that one shows essentially a very sweet woman with, it's described as, down on the bottom, it says woman voter. And she's holding a key, which is the right to vote. And she wants to unlock this poor bedraggled woman that's called an Eastern suffragist that's behind bars. And the man, who's also a donkey and obviously a Democrat, is saying frightfulness. He's saying, this will upset me a great deal if you use that key, the right to vote, to let this woman out. So that was, and again, look at the theme, the typical political cartoons of the era that opposed women suffragists would have depicted them as ugly, mean, radical, unattractive. And Allender had the wisdom to portray them all as traditionally feminine, attractive, and sympathetic. And I think those were probably good strategies on the part of the political cartoonists to actually help get the amendment passed.
I think it's neat that you shared this chapter, Mary, because it actually reminds me a lot of what I see you do when you're crafting an appellate argument. You're framing your client sympathetically and knowing your audience and how to most effectively communicate with them. And I hadn't really thought about that until I was listening to you right now, and that's a really neat thing that resonates. Speaking of women going to jail for the right to vote, I think Kate's going to close out on our most impactful chapters by talking about chapter 17, which is called Jailed for Freedom.
Thanks, Marianne. Yes, this chapter was incredibly moving. It focused on the American women who had picketed the White House and served time in jail in 1917. And almost 500 women were arrested on the suffrage picket lines between 1917 and 1919, and close to about 170 of them served jail time in prison. And these suffragists were so committed to the cause that they voluntarily risked their reputations and essentially their lives because, I mean, the conditions in some of these prisons were just very, very poor. They did this all to secure the women's right to vote. Some of you might know Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. They're obviously legendary in these suffrage circles, but the book actually, this chapter actually focuses on Hazel Hunkins, who really wasn't given a spotlight in history books. She was an only child growing up, and she grew up in Billings, Montana. And she actually, when she was growing up, she mentioned to her parents that she wanted to become a doctor. And her father replied that only men could become doctors, and told her that she should instead become a nurse. So she began her fight for suffrage when she was actually introduced to Anna Louise Rowe, who was trying to establish a Montana branch of the National Women's Party. Hazel was found to be a very persuasive organizer. So they scooted her off to Washington, D.C. to join the picketing efforts in front of the White House. And for the first half of 1917, her, along with the NWP pickets, literally stood up to President Woodrow Wilson as he came and went through the White House doors. Just as an aside, I didn't know this when I was reading the book, and I thought it was pretty neat. You know, picketing the White House is now such a staple in a political life that it's often overlooked that the suffragists were actually the first ever to use this tactic at that symbolic location. So I thought that was pretty neat. I did not know that. And as you can imagine, during these picketing efforts, things got ugly pretty fast. Passerbys would tear their banners, they'd spit on the women, altercations broke out. So the local police started getting involved and probably were getting pushed a little bit or a lot by the Wilson administration to start arresting and jailing these women, these picketers, for disorderly conduct and obstructing sidewalk traffic. And according to one newspaper account, apparently when President Wilson would walk outside of the White House and see some of these arrests going on across the street, he would apparently smile. And these women that were arrested were giving crazy long sentences for just picketing. For example, Alice Paul got served a 7-month sentence for just obstructing traffic on a sidewalk. And like I said earlier, in prison, they were subjected to really awful conditions, inevitable food, humiliating treatment, lack of communication with the outside world, just really awful conditions. And the Wilson administration actually hoped that this would cripple the suffrage activism. with these long prison sentences and these terrible conditions, but the strategy actually backfired. So many of these women would immediately go on hunger strikes when they were put into prison, that the authorities actually worried, you know, maybe one of these suffragists are going to die on our watch. So when that worry started happening, they cut the sentences short and released a lot of the suffragists. Kind of going back to Hazel Hunkins, who was featured mainly in this chapter, she was arrested multiple times, and actually during one of her sentences, she, along with many suffragists, were moved to a different prison. This was an abandoned jail building in a swampy district, prison grounds. The conditions were so bad that all the protesters immediately went on hunger strike. And on top of their hunger, there was also this terrible smell from the open drains, and the water was declared unsanitary. So Hunkins actually succumbed to the poisonous gases and water, and it was told that she became absolutely limp in her cell. And of course, word got out that these conditions were so bad, so the Wilson administration came in, ended all the sentences, and the prisoners were released. So I just thought this chapter was very moving, that these women were willing to, you know, risk their lives going into these awful conditions, getting arrested for, you know, such a great cause.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I thank you for sharing that, Kate. The next question that I think I've heard some of you touch on in some of your responses is, did you learn anything that surprised you, or how did the book compare to what you'd learned in school about women's suffrage? And why don't we go ahead and maybe start with Natasha here. Natasha, I think you're on mute.
Yes. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay. You think it's bad in a webinar being muted and talking? Try it like in a hearing. So yes, Marianne, I mean, in school, there was very little about the suffrage movement outside of Susan B. Anthony and even Elizabeth Stanton. But I was surprised to learn about a little bit of the backstory of the suffrage amendment proposed in 1878. I didn't know that you know, the suffrage movement went out that early. And this amendment was known as the amendment that never was. And it was drafted to provide universal suffrage. And that would be getting, you know, the right to vote for immigrants, Native Americans, Black men and women. And so one of the things that I thought was interesting was that, you know, that idea essentially got scrapped when the white suffragists started to kind of incorporate advocacy for Jim Crow type laws. And, you know, we believe that that was done so that they could get the support of the southern states behind the 19th. And had this 1878 amendment been adopted, you know, questions like, would there be the voter suppression that we see now? Would that be as prevalent? And, you know, I imagine that maybe it wouldn't be. But the 1920 amendment certainly capitalized on Black disenfranchisement. And so, you know, I really think that that is probably why it was ratified. And I thought, interestingly, I did learn that Mississippi didn't ratify the 19th Amendment until 1984, when I was 3. So anyway, that backstory about the First Amendment, that was interesting to me.
Hailey, what about you? How did this compare to what you knew already about women's suffrage?
Well, I think Natasha's right. You know, I mean, what we learned in school was a lot about Anthony and Stanton, and I was surprised, and perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, but more about learning more about the interplay between the fight for African Americans, men's right to vote, and women's right to vote, which harkens back to Natasha's discussion of Truth's United Woman speech and the advocacy by Anthony and Stanton of the Jim Crow type laws in order to advance their cause, because perhaps they believed that women's right to vote was more important and should be given primacy, which I think goes to the question of, who should be given priority and when and why. And it was interesting to learn more about that background.
Were there any stories that you thought should have been included in the book that weren't? And I'll open that up to any of the panelists, Mary or Kate or Hailey or Natasha, if you thought the book was missing anything.
I'll touch briefly on, sorry for interrupting you, Natasha. The fact that the book didn't really speak about Native American women's role in suffrage movement. And I learned recently about the Iroquois women and the tribe who practiced a form of democracy that gave significant power to women. Their society was matrilineal, and women made many of the decisions and participated in public life. So they became powerful inspirations to suffragists who saw them as examples of a more equal world. And it would have been interesting to learn more about their influence on the suffragists' view of equality.
That's a great story. I wish too there would have been a little bit more about some of maybe the Mexican American advocates for women's suffrage along the border here in Texas. I know that I've read some about their stories before, but overall I know it's hard to tell everybody's stories in a 300-page book, but that was my personal thoughts on it. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to share about stories they wish were included?
Well, I had one. I didn't realize it was 300 pages because I got the audio version and it was about 8 hours. But I would have really have liked to have seen more on Harriet Tubman. And there was a small mention of her, but we all we know her as the Black Moses is what some of us call her, for her work with saving so many slaves on the Underground Railroad. But she really became a vocal advocate for women's rights after the 14th Amendment, and seeing that, Black men were getting rights on paper. And so that really motivated her to push for women's rights. And, she spoke at conventions in 1888. She spoke at a convention and really, warned everybody that, look, this is going to be just as hard as my fight freeing slaves on the Underground Railroad. So I really would have liked to have seen more about her.
No, I agree. And so now that I see that the time's about 12:45, and I want to make sure we wrap up and leave plenty of time for questions. And so if anyone, I see that Pete Kennedy has shared a couple of questions in the group chat. If anybody else has any comments or reactions, if you want to use the raise your hand feature or share it with everybody, the whole group in the chat, we'll go ahead and try to address some of those. If Kate and Mary and Hailey, y'all could take yourselves off mute also. I think one question or a couple points that I saw Pete made was just about how the U.S. suffrage movement, comparing the tactics it used versus the tactics used in the United Kingdom. I think you may be familiar with the name Pinkhurst in Britain, which I was actually watching a documentary a couple weeks ago about how at one time they actually planted a bomb under the Cardinal's seat in I think St. Paul's Cathedral in London, in kind of what they thought was advancing the right to vote in the United Kingdom. And we don't have instances like that to point to here. It definitely was more violent and more physical in the United Kingdom. And the book didn't really touch on that, a comparison. And I think that's maybe would be another thing that would have been interesting, is how the movements kind of differed across different countries, even at the same time period. And then other question I saw on here was about if anybody read about or had any thoughts on the connection between the 19th Amendment and the temperance movement that was occurring around the same time. and what if the book explored the connection between the two. And I don't think it really did. Mary, do you think it did?
No, but it is, I think that women getting the right to vote may have had something to do with the 20s being a dry period. Yeah. Yes. Not sure that was one of our better moments there.
And so I think that I've answered. Yeah, I don't see any more questions. So let's go ahead and just wrap up a little bit. If any of the panelists want to share a favorite quote from the book, or if each of you, or if you'd want to share maybe what you think the legacy of the 19th Amendment is today, we'd love to hear that to wrap up, and then we'll go over just some kind of closing remarks.
I can do one.
Yeah, that'd be great, Mary.
Okay. I'm going to go back to Ida Wells Barnett because, and it was basically with that march that she was involved in. And there was another white member of the delegation, commented to her, says, well, this is quoted in the book, if I were a colored woman, I should be willing to march with the other women of my race. And Wells Barnett had a pretty sharp response. She said, there is a difference, which you probably do not see. I shall not march with the colored women. Either I go with you or not at all. I am not taking this stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my whole race. And I guess that I found like a quote. It was one of the few quotes that were in the chapters that I featured. It just showed a persistence, a calmness, a willingness to just keep trying. And I found that very admirable. And just and that's kind of what I felt a lot about this movement, is that it seemed, obviously people being put in jail, but for the most part, it was relatively done with civility and trying to work within the system. And I think that's kind of what's important to me about the legacy of the 19th Amendment, is that they ultimately used the law to achieve what's just and right. It's odd that it would have to take a constitutional amendment to do that, but that I think is a pretty important legacy. And being lawyers, I guess I have a lot of respect for the rule of law and the use of it to effect change.
I had a favorite quote. This was in chapter 13 by Annie Peck Smith, who I briefly spoke about earlier. She was the lady who climbed the second highest mountain in Peru. And her quote is pretty simple. We should be free to do whatever we think we are qualified for. And I just thought that, I thought that was really impactful, and it's very true. She was one of the best known climbers, and it's so simply stated, and it's very true. So I like that quote.
I had one I wanted to share really quickly from Susan B. Anthony. So it was at the end of chapter 1. It says, challenged in one of the court proceedings as to whether she had presented herself as a female claiming the right to vote, she replied, I presented myself not as a female at all, sir. I presented myself as a citizen of the United States. And I think that resonated with me too, because I feel, women are so often described in terms of their relation to men. So she's a mother, she's a daughter, she's a wife, and where does she's a citizen come in that pecking order? So I found that very interesting.
Natasha, did you have any final quotes or thoughts on the legacy of the 19th Amendment to share?
I did. And so chapter 12 was kind of a study of the suffragists abroad. And, we didn't really cover that one today, but it featured the work of Mary Church Terrell. And she was a very famous African-American civil rights activist, well known in DC. And she had the opportunity to basically travel Europe as a young woman, learn various languages. And she was at basically the Berlin Conference for International Women's Rights. she had the opportunity to basically explain to the world what the women's suffrage fight looks like for Black women in America, and kind of gin up support for her cause. And, you know, she kind of things that you don't really think about, but she was nervous. She was the only Black woman at this huge delegation, but she says, I'm representing all Africans, not just African Americans, because there were women disenfranchised all over the world. And so she says, whenever courage oozes away, I would think of the opportunity miraculously afforded to me of presenting the facts credible to colored women of the United States, and my spirit would immediately revive. And I think that's just part of why the women fought. You know, they had just this vision of the future and future generations being able to do what they couldn't. So that really stuck with me.
That is a great quote. And I don't think I could sum it up better than Mary Church Terrell. So I think we'll just go ahead and move on to the concluding remarks. As a quick reminder, when you log off, you're going to get a survey link, which will just allow you to give us some feedback about the presentation, maybe what you'd be interested in attending in the future. And most importantly, normally we would have gathered together in person, and we would have liked to probably sent you home with a special treat or something like that. We're going to try to mail it to you. So if you're interested, if you'd please provide your mailing address so we can figure out how to get a special thank you sent over to you. And then finally, Melissa, would you put it on the additional resources? I know for me, this and all of us, we talked about it, this kind of really opened our eyes to a lot of things we still didn't know about the history of women's suffrage in the United States. And I know also, like Natasha, a lot of us are at home becoming Zoom teachers with kids too, and just how much I wish I would have maybe learned about this too when I was younger. So these are some resources that you might be interested in looking into at home if you have some kids at home. Finish the Fight is a book by Veronica Chambers that's really good for middle schoolers. And similarly for elementary kids, there's some more storybooks, Bold and the Brave and Equality's Call, that are a little heavier on illustrations about the history of voting rights and the right to vote for women in America. And then last, PBS Learning has, I'm sure if you're at home with kids, you've discovered has some really great resources. If you Google PBS Learning Media and Teaching Women's Suffrage, there's a great website that has tons of resources on it. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. It's been our pleasure, and we hope that next year and future we'll be able to gather with you in person to celebrate the 101st anniversary of the 19th Amendment.
Are you going to tell them what the gift is?
Oh, you can tell them, Mary.
It's a really cool, is it a 500-piece puzzle? It's in a circle, and it's various women in the suffrage movement. I want one.
And so it is really neat. It is, I saw the preview of it, and it's not just, Susan B. Anthony and another person. It's like, has like 100 different people, and it'd be neat to be able to one day learn about all of them. So thank you again, and watch for that link as you exit. And if not, we may send it follow up via an email. And also, I forgot to say, if you're interested in talking more, or you have further questions, we'll stay on for a few more minutes. And if you want to discuss or just catch up, we're happy to reconnect with everybody virtually this afternoon.
It looks like Jackie Mata has raised your hand.
Oh.
She's muted though. She's got to unmute. Can we do that for her? There.
All I can say is thank you, thank you, thank you. This was amazing, and I'll put that in words in your survey, but I just wanted you to hear my excitement for what a great lunch this was. And then you say there's a gift too, like you just made our day.
Thank you, Jackie.
We've still got about 10 people on. So if anyone else wants to raise their hand and tell us how great they think we are in person, it's welcome. You can edit this out of the recording, Melissa.
Well, I want to say thank you to my good friend Audrey Fisher for attending all the way from Florida. And that's the silver lining of this pandemic is we can connect with people across the country.
So cool.
Oh,
Thank you so much for having me. I very much enjoyed it. Very informative.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank all of y'all for coming.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
And we should have mentioned, I saw we have some attendees from Colorado on, and Colorado is interesting because it's actually the first state in to allow women's suffrage. So that's a unique history that's part of the heritage of Colorado.
I didn't know that. That's cool.
It was in the Western states. That's where it kind of became the most common.
Mm-hmm.
And they were suffragettes, right? In Colorado, at least one organization, I think they followed that nomenclature.
You're being too much of a lawyer, Natasha.
Well, it's in the blood, right?
Exactly.
I know. Well, I was thinking that all of these women, especially Ida Wells Barnett, sounds like she would have been an excellent lawyer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Reading the story about Sojourner Truth's legal battle for custody for her son was amazing. I wish the book had put that in there.
Yeah.
I mean, she was on her own, negotiating with the lawyers to figure this out, to get her son from Alabama to New York. And I guess the argument on the other side was, well, in Alabama, slavery's still legal. So he was sold from New York, though, where slavery was not legal. So that's what she won on.
A conflict of laws issue?
Exactly.
The transaction, I hate to say it this way, but the transaction occurred in New York. And so that's how she won. But I mean, she crafted that argument all on her own.
That's amazing.
So impressive.
Yeah. I was actually, my Inn of Court has to do a presentation in December, and I was thinking it would be neat to do some of the options you can present are like reenacting historical trials. So I thought it would be neat to write a script for maybe like that legal case. I think there's already one out there for the Susan B. Anthony trial that history teachers use sometimes, but there's really a lot of different legal kind of events that you could put into a dramatic form.
That would be cool. Invite me to that Inns of Court meeting.
Will do. Well, it looks like most everybody has logged off already, so we'll go ahead and wave goodbye. Feel free to connect with us via email or give us a call. And again, thank you so much for joining us. This was really, with everything going on, it was really a highlight to see so many people were able to join us and take a moment out of their days to spend time here. So thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.